Hello and good morning. Welcome. Thank you all for joining today's Humanities webinar presented by the New York Botanical Gardens Humanities Institute. The New York Botanical Garden is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape, the Delaware people, and we honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. I am Vanessa Sellers, Director of the Gardens Humanities Institute, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you from locations across the United States and around the world to explore new studies in food humanities, the title of this year's Mellon Fellows presentations. I am really delighted to introduce Audrey Jenkins and Dr. Claire Bunschoten, whom we've been so lucky to have them as our Mellon Fellows studying at the garden all year. And today they will offer a research report showing how their research here at the garden benefited, how they've benefited from the historical collections at the Lou Esther T. Mertz Library, the William and Linda Steer Herbarium, and our living collections in the Edible Academy and the African American Garden, as well as the surrounding landscapes and Bronx community gardens. They all helped to inform their studies. And these innovative studies stimulate really critical thinking at the intersection of science and humanities, especially plant and food humanities. Our first speaker is Audrey Jenkins. She comes to us from the New School, the School of Policy Management and Environment, where she is a PhD student studying public and urban policy. Audrey's work focuses on community gardens and their role and potential in community development, urban planning, and land stewardship in the context of migration and social ecological transformation. Today, she will trace the historical landscape of urban growing in the Bronx and how community gardens mark a turn in perspective and potential in urban planning and politics. Here is Audrey. Audrey.
Hi, everyone. I've just realized that I'm not able to share my screen. So if someone could enable that. Okay, I see it now. All right. Thank you so much, Vanessa, and hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to present some of my work as a Mellon Fellow this year at the New York Botanical Garden. As Vanessa mentioned, I'm a PhD student in my third year at the New School studying urban policy, public and urban policy, and I'm interested in how cities can be inclusive and equitable as they respond to pressing needs to make systems socially and ecologically healthy and resilient. My research looks at community gardens' material, social, and cultural infrastructure to ask how these spaces can influence urban change. Particularly, I'm looking at this in the context of social ecological transformation and migration. As a Mellon Research Fellow at the New York Botanical Gardens this past year, I've been able to work on developing my framing for my research as an invaluable support as I move forward in the dissertation process. So as a fellow, I've been able to both be in the gardens themselves, where I can learn by doing and by observing, and by meeting so many amazing people with the support of the Botanical Gardens Community Garden Support Division, Bronx Green Up, and by reading as well in the Botanical Gardens Mertz Library, which has an incredible resource that's actually available and open to the public as well. I also coded and studied Bronx Foodways Oral History Project interviews, which were produced by the Botanical Gardens Humanities Institute in collaboration with many long-term gardeners in the Bronx. And I spent a lot of time at the Bronx County Historical Society, which you'll see a little bit about today. And I was even able to spend a little time in the archival materials at the Bronx Green Up. So it's been just a very enriching experience, and I'm so glad that I've been able to start my research from this position. Before we move on, I just want to mention that my background here is a photo of Carroll's Community Farm. You can see just one piece of this massive farm at Castle Hill Houses in the Bronx. It's stewarded by Castle Hill residents and by Shay Cooper, who is the horticulturalist at NYBG's Community Garden Support Division, the Bronx Green Up. And you can see in this photo some volunteers who were there during a work day, as well as some of last year's collard greens that were flowering when I visited a month ago in April. So I'm using this background throughout my presentation because I want to keep our minds outside in the gardens, which is the focus of my talk today. So to start out, I just have two concepts I'd like to mention. The first is transformation. As I mentioned, I'm interested in social ecological transformation, which is a change of how human systems engage and relate with ecological systems. The diagram you see here represents a model of how we get from a present scenario to possible futures. The bottom and middle projections are not far off from what we might expect from existing infrastructure in society today. However, transformation, the top projection, reflects a more radical shift towards a desired future. And that word desired highlights the political element and processes of change. Whose desires are we talking about? Who's at the table? My research focuses on the wavy arrows, the pathways that get us from the present to the desired future. The second concept I want to mention is deep democracy. You see in the diagram the word co-production, which is about inclusivity in planning and implementation, having the right set of diverse actors at the table. Deep democracy, the way I think of it, is a layer added to this goal. Deep democracy, according to a paper by McIver and Hale, is about having resources and sustained relationship building that allows for collective control over factors that impact our lives. Deep democracy means opening channels for inclusiveness long-term, not just during isolated projects here and there. So I'm interested in whether and how community gardens can act as spaces for the sustained inclusion and deep democracy and processes of change. And today I chose to focus on the history of land stewardship in the Bronx over the centuries that can help to contextualize my findings in the oral histories and what I've been observing in the Bronx over the past year around this possibility of democracy and inclusion. So I'm going to start pretty far back. The Bronx was first attempted to be settled by colonizers back in the 1600s. And as we all know, the land was already a home space and used by Lenape and other indigenous people who had the way that people had been using and stewarding that land did not include an idea of having cordoned off private land necessarily. There were periods when people could farm a piece of land, and that would have been, they would have been using that to grow corn and other crops, but then that land would turn back over into common use after they were done. And so the introduction of a private land logic that came in with the Dutch colonist definitely added something new in the way that land stewardship was conducted. And in these two pictures here that I got from the Historical Society, you can see some of the progression of agreements that were made by colonists over who was going to be in control of that land. And a story that I want to bring up from my reading in that context is that the Bronx was actually one of the last areas in the New York space that settlers began to colonize, partially because there was so much contestation over that space. And so in the late 1600s, there's a number of conflicts that occurred. And one of those conflicts, the story goes, is that an indigenous woman attempted to take a peach from someone's garden down in the Manhattan Island. And that initiated a conflict that led to a lot of attacks in the Bronx area and drove a lot of colonists who were attempting in that 1640s period to live there, drove them out. So it took a number of years, over 50 years, for the Bronx to kind of be settled by Dutch colonists and British colonists that were coming down. And so the Bronx then, over the course of the next 200 years, slowly became an agrarian space. Here you can see, this is the late 1800s, kind of a map of where the Grand Concourse area is in the Bronx. I'm showing a map here so you get an idea. I've added a little color here to this map so you can kind of see that it was still a bit rural along the area that faces the Manhattan Island. And in a lot of the areas of the Bronx were still pretty rural and were being farmed by families, largely like German immigrants who had come over into that area. And so even into the 1920s, there was still a farm over in the Castle Hill area, as you can see here. And so I found some interesting stuff about how people were thinking about stewarding land differently. This is an example by an activist who was very interested in getting land for the public. And so the idea was that the city would purchase land and own land, and then poor people, as you can see, this article by Bolton Hall, who was the activist, he was trying to get the city to own land, and then people could steward that land. So they could grow food off of that land for a very low price. And so this is actually an early example at the turn of the century of someone trying to use vacant lots around the city, trying to find spaces and enable people to actually grow food for themselves. But the idea was largely around people kind of changing the power dynamic and providing something for poor people. This is land that they can then grow food on and economically support themselves. And I just put some underlines under a few names that you might recognize here. I think it's just interesting to note that Booker T. Washington was actually mentioned as a supporter of this movement, as well as J.P. Morgan and the son of, I'm sure we all know, Lloyd Garrison. And so it really was an early idea that didn't seem to go very far, but I just wanted to highlight that. Around the same time, there's a movement, a progressive movement to change the way that the environments that poor people were living in. And it was generally looked at as improving the urban spaces for the urban poor. And so you can see that one of the first gardens that was put together, documented in New York, is a children's garden. And this garden was put together by someone who was looking for, so this is Parsons, and she was looking for space to try bringing agriculture back to children. And so this is a part of a movement that was happening at the time. There were kind of two separate movements. One of them was the nature study movement to bring nature to children, largely focusing on children in agriculture spaces because there was a movement of people towards the cities. And this movement of bringing nature into the schools and teaching children about nature gradually made its way to the cities as well. And so the idea was to teach kids about nature and to bring some civilizing traits and Americanizing traits to largely poor immigrant communities. And these were largely Western immigrant communities in New York. And so this garden was originally kind of a trash dump, and Parsons describes the way that they got together, they cleaned it up, and then she creates this farm that is then kind of run as, I wouldn't say, a little bit militantly. And so she describes being a woman standing in the farm and using a whistle to get kids to farm along very regimented ways. So she'd blow the whistle, they put the seeds into the soil. And the idea was that this was bringing nature to children, but also bringing a civilizing factor to kids. These are some examples. So that movement actually kind of grew into school garden movement. And so these examples, I want to highlight some of the school gardens in the Bronx. Over the beginning of the 20th century, you had a growing interest in bringing gardens into the city for the exact reason of nature connection, of bringing food access, and especially economic access into these areas of the city. But it burgeoned and really became something that there was a school garden committee in New York City, an association that was included a ton of organizations, including the botanical gardens in the city, including the Natural History Museum, including tons of schools. And these movements changed the way that kids were engaging with nature in the schools. And eventually in the World War I period, were used as victory gardens. And so there was a huge movement at the national level to actually support this kind of work up until the 1920s. So here's another example. This is actually a public park. This is St. Mary's Park that still exists in the Bronx. And you can see that kids were using this. This is actually a school, a number of schools that were using this park to do their school gardens. And the public parks actually supported the cultivation and maintenance of these gardens as well. But funding kind of dried out. So at the turn of the World War II period, when that period ended, there was a lack of interest after the war in supporting these gardens for a number of reasons. People were moving out to the suburbs. People were kind of turning to their private backyards. And there was a lot of interest in supporting home gardens at that point. And I just put this up to show you how big that Victory Garden period was. So this is around 1919, I believe. And this is a photo of a victory or a demonstration garden in Union Square that right after, so after this like huge interest, all of that funding dried up. And so you no longer had as much support for school gardens in the city as people were moving out. Another thing that happened is that immigration got curtailed quite a bit. And so there wasn't this idea of needing to like Americanize children in these cities. And so in the Bronx, I want to highlight something that I found in the archives. This is a really interesting 50-year anniversary celebration put out by the Bronx Board of Trade. And this is in 1944. So they were trying to look forward and understand how were they going to use the money that was coming out of the World War II, the post-World War II era. And so the push at this point was to develop. And so there had been a huge amount of development in the Bronx. It was pretty urbanized, but they wanted to improve the spaces. And in this particular document, they actually mentioned that the efforts of the Board of Trade and Development are not, they're apolitical. And I thought that was a very interesting look into how people were thinking about the decisions that were being made around urban planning in this space. And I also want to highlight, so this picture is James Leon, who was the Bronx Borough president at the time. This is Robert Moses, who I think many of us have heard of, who infamously, today we think of it as infamously instituted a lot of urban renewal and highway building across the Bronx, including the Cross Bronx Expressway. And you can kind of see here the extent of the development that happened during that period. And this led to thousands of people, families being moved out of the Bronx. It also opened up a lot of arteries out into the suburbs. And so this is a period of a lot of white flight and change in social demographics in the borough, and led to eventually a lot of disinvestment as well in the communities that were being bypassed in these spaces. And so another kind of shift at this time in the 60s was an effort to recognize the fact that the cities were disinvested. Parts of the cities, especially parts of the city that were now immigrants that were more Black and brown. And so there was an effort to look at public space and use these little spaces in the city to create more community interaction and more democracy and engagement. And so in urban planning, there was actually a push at this time to engage the public in deciding what to do with these spaces. And so you can see on the right side panel that these kids are being advertised as basically consultants for a company as part of how these urban planners were thinking about engaging people in the development of spaces. Critiques, obviously, of this approach included the lack of sustained interest in the spaces. There's a lot of commercialization of even the playground materials that you see here is a specific company that was trying to really push its kind of modular playground equipment. And it wasn't looked at as like stewardship of the space. It was more looked at as a way to engage the public space as a space for everyone to engage each other. And so it was thought of as a democratic movement, but in reality did not lead to success in terms of sustained interest from the communities. One of the things that did come out of the pocket parks, however, was a couple of these pocket parks were actually gardens. And the critique that is made around these gardens is that they were closed off. They had fences. They were not kind of living up to the ideals of this era of community public space creation. And they were looked at as kind of a failure of the pocket park movement because they didn't support some of those democratic ideas necessarily. But I want to kind of critique that a little bit and think more about what these gardens actually end up meaning for people, what they mean for the communities, and whether or not they really are exclusive, or if they actually enable more of an inclusive urban space. So as we shift into the 70s, so that was like the 60s, the late 60s, as we shift into the 70s, we have a expansion of this urban planning effort through the creation of Green Guerrillas. So the Green Guerrillas was actually created by Liz Christie, who was an urban planner and was interested in a radical way of taking over vacant lots. So she would bomb lots with seeds and really started a movement and an organization called Green Guerrillas, which we just had the 50th anniversary of, and that's what you see here. And this movement led to people kind of taking ownership of these vacant lots in their neighborhoods, many of which had been completely abandoned. Buildings had been burned down during disinvestment period. And so the Bronx was actually, much of the Bronx and the South Bronx especially, was covered with vacant lots that had rubble in them, that had trash in them that people had put there. And through the 70s and 80s and early 90s period, there were also a lot of cases of people finding individuals who had overdosed or had died in those spaces. And so it really was an effort by the community to attempt to change and beautify, but also activate their neighborhood in a new way. And so I'm just want to show you some photos. This is Brook Park, which exists today, but you can see a little bit of a garden happening on the right side. So this is 1980. And on the other side of the garden, you can kind of see the trellis in that left photo is just a rubble lot. And that's completely changed. So during that period, people were trying to create something new, and it's led to a sustained stewardship of this land. And so you have this massive space. It's very beautiful. These photos are kind of, it's the winter and fall, but it's just an incredible garden. And the way that the community has actually maintained engagement with these spaces differs so completely from the pocket park idea, and also from the way that school gardens had been operating before, that I started to wonder also about how people's relationship with the land connected with the growing and what happens in the garden itself. So I wanted to show you how expansive these gardens are. And so this is a photo of, so in the South Bronx, you have Brook Park over here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, and you have Carroll Garden, Carroll Community Farm over here in this area, but there are over 200 gardens throughout the Bronx area itself. And they're managed and stewarded in very different ways. But I want to finish up by talking about the oral histories briefly. And so these are oral histories that the garden had put together and that I spent a lot of time looking through. And I want to highlight just a few things, because I know I don't have a lot of time, that came out of the oral histories analysis that I conducted. And the way that people activate the spaces and build a relationship with the land is very important. And so it really comes out of community care. The way that these spaces are activated is not just about growing food. It's not just about having a place to garden, but there's so much discussion of community care in these spaces. And the way that they act as having multiple meetings for many different people. It's very important that people have the formal support, but there is also such a individual responsibility in creating what the gardens mean and what they can provide. And so I'm very interested in how that differs from kind of something that's provided from the top, but having instead the opportunity to kind of define the space and define it through your relationships with people and with the garden. And so these are just a couple pictures. This is Danny on the left side in Brook Park, and this is Paula Lucas, a teacher in a school garden, also in the Bronx on the right side. And I wanted to highlight New Roots. So this is a rice paddy that is being put in at New Roots, and I just learned about it last weekend. But I think it represents a very interesting piece of how people decide what to put in these spaces and the importance that they bring for community engagement. So the rice paddy happened because there were people who were trying to grow rice on their own. And so the way that New Roots works is they experiment first with what can be grown and what people want to grow. And then they expand on that. If people want it, they try to implement it. So they're actually putting a rice paddy in this garden. And the exciting thing is that rice is something that means a lot to people, will bring people into the garden, into the space, outside of the gardeners themselves, as well as the gardeners. So I think that's really wonderful. And I want to end with an effort that we are pulling together right now, which is to bring community gardeners into the herbarium. And this is a photo here of Carlos and Ken Walker, who is an ethnobotanist at the Botanical Garden. And this is an example of an herbarium specimen. So the idea is to actually bring the meaning that people have connected with the land and with that space into the herbarium to preserve it long-term for the gardeners themselves and for people to understand that. And so I just want to end by saying, I feel like I ran out of time pretty quickly, but I just want to end by saying thank you to everyone who has made this time that I've been able to spend in the gardens possible. I look forward to continuing the work and the efforts that we've started, and I can't wait to share more of my research with you as it develops. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for that very, very meaningful presentation. Thank you. There's much to think about and discuss, and we will do so. But first, here is our second speaker, Dr. Claire Bunschoten. She just recently received her PhD in American Studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And in the fall, will join the American and New England Studies program at Boston University as a postdoctoral fellow. Her dissertation and also her future book project, Extracts, Essences, and Political Effects, How Vanilla Shapes American Life, examines vanilla as a flavor, as a fragrance, and euphemism for race in the United States. Please, Claire, the podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'll be sharing my screen in a moment. Let's see. Okay, there we are. Fabulous. Thank you again. And thank you so much to everyone at NYBG for this opportunity. It's such a treat to see so many familiar names in the participants list. I'm so thrilled here. Thank you for coming and making the time. So yes, my name is Claire Bunschoten. I'm a Mellon Humanities Fellow in the Food Humanities this year at the New York Botanical Garden and a newly minted PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. My background is in American Studies with an emphasis in critical food studies, material culture studies, and sensory studies. My projects tend to focus on food objects that require or extend from the fruits of plants, and today I'll be talking a bit about some work emerging from my NYPG fellowship and doctoral project, which considers vanilla in the US cultural landscape. So we experience vanilla in many different forms, as you can see from this collage here, from body lotion to candles to Frappuccino. And my larger projects treats vanilla as a multi-sided, multi-sensorial object. So although I am primarily oriented to sites of consumption, especially when it comes to acts of eating, but also sniffing, seeing, listening, and buying, purchasing, It is also vital to understand how vanilla is produced and how it is abstracted from the sites of its production. In both of these processes of vanilla production and consumption, there are many layers of extraction, both literally and metaphorically at play. So this talk today will focus on two moments of technological innovation in vanilla's very long history. For the 19th century, invention of the vanilla orchid's marriage, and the 21st century genetic engineering of E. coli bacteria to synthesize, quote, natural vanillin, which is vanilla's largest flavor molecule. So both moments, although nearly 2 centuries apart, attempt to solve the same problem, the human desire for vanilla and the vanilla orchid's resistance to capitalist logics of efficiency, which has consistently limited the global supply of vanilla since earliest attempts to cultivate it. So taking this plant's resistance seriously, I argue that our contemporary relationship with vanilla requires a critical reevaluation. The vanilla bean is the second most expensive spice in the world, trailing only saffron, and its expense is largely tied to its labor-intensive cultivation. The vanilla orchid, Vanilla planifolia, is an evergreen vine that prefers to grow in warm, humid forests and is thought to originate in southern Mexico through Central America, Colombia, and northern portions of Brazil. When mature, the vanilla orchid will flower about once a year over a period of 2 months. So on the screen now is the specimen in the Enid Haupt Conservatory here at NYPG in bloom this last January. I was got a call that it was in bloom and rushed over. It was a fabulous, fabulous day. So each flower is only open for about 24-hour period, which is a really small window for pollination. And if successfully pollinated, the orchid's fruit takes about 9 months to develop on the vine. When harvested, these vanilla pods, what we call vanilla beans, are relatively odorless. To develop the characteristic brown color and flavor of these green beans, they must be cured for 3 months. You can see the beans in these 3 processes of curing on the right. And the curing of vanilla beans is an artisanal process that requires the careful management of humidity to prevent mold and bacterial growth while maximizing flavor development. The Mexican historian Emilio Curi asserts that, quote, nothing is known about the origins of cured vanilla in Mesoamerica, but by the early 16th century, prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, it was already well established as an ingredient in the medicinal and gastronomic practices of the Mayas, the Nahus, and their Aztec rulers. So while Francisco Hernandez's Rara Medicarum Novae Hispania Thesaurus describes vanilla's use for easing digestion, inducing abortions, facilitating urination, and clearing the mind, the fruit's culinary applications appealed more to Spanish conquistadors who encountered vanilla in Mexico as a flavoring for a beverage made with cacao beans. So over the course of the 17th century, a market emerged for vanilla in Europe, and exportation began to intensify. Notably, however, up until sometime in the 18th century, vanilla beans were foraged by indigenous peoples and often sold to the Spanish to supplement their subsistence economies. By the 1760s, the Totonacs based in the states of Veracruz, Puebla, and Hidalgo began to plant the vanilla orchid around the towns of Colipa and Papelanta on community-owned forests and meadows near the port city of Veracruz. So over time, it became more intensely cultivated to increase yields. However, the plant's limited growth and limited supply as well, along with this laborious curing process, continued to limit the global supply. So although Europeans have been interested in vanilla for largely taxonomic purposes, since the 17th century, attempts to grow vanilla beans outside of Central and South America largely failed. The botanist Charles Morin developed a technique for artificial pollination in 1836, but the cultivation of vanilla outside of Mexico was truly revolutionized in 1841 by Edmund Albius, an enslaved 12-year-old boy who lived on the island of Reunion, then a French colony called Bourbon, which is why we call some vanilla varieties Bourbon vanilla. And Albius received instruction in horticulture and eventually realized that if he joined the flower's sex organs with a small wooden stick and a pinch of his fingers, that he could artificially pollinate the plant and bring it to fruit. This is a technique sometimes referred to as the marriage. And French colonies in the Indian Ocean rapidly adopted this new botanical technology through the work of enslaved laborers and radically shifted the world's supply of vanilla beans. So this map from Kew Gardens helps illustrate vanilla's spread around the globe, which was facilitated immensely by this new technology. The purple is for migration. Okay. So while the French colonies largely produced for the French market in the 19th century, gradually this hand pollination technique became an industry standard. even where the plant was once insect pollinated. A 2020 study suggested that even in Central and South America today, the vanilla orchid's chance of pollination by an insect was only about 1%. Our contemporary relationship with the vanilla bean and the vanilla orchid is sustained by huge amounts of human labor, from Albius's hand pollination method, which is still in use today, to hand curing processes demonstrated here in this image, to manual sorting and massaging. Ultimately, vanilla beans are touched by human hands hundreds, if not thousands of times before they go to market. Today, Madagascar is the world's leading vanilla producer, responsible for about 40% of the global vanilla bean supply, and one of the poorest countries in the world. In March 2017, tropical cyclone Anawo hit the Sava region of Madagascar, as you can see on this map, and destroyed about 30% of Madagascar's vanilla orchids, resulting in a global shortage and record high prices. In the wake of the storm, top vanilla producers charged between $600 and $750 per kilogram of vanilla beans, which was a record high. Although this boom economy was welcomed by growers, it was also met with new anxieties and increased instances of theft. And theft has been a longstanding feature of the vanilla industry for centuries, but this intensification here is quite significant. So for example, this is a photo of workers in a warehouse being pat down as they exited their job at a vanilla packing facility in Madagascar. The owner of this facility told the New York Times that because the vanilla beans are so small and pliable, that they are very easy to hide, and quote, similar to the diamond trade in South Africa. And yet thieves in the society of wealth and extreme poverty persist. So in this photo, we can see Nunat Auckland, a small farmer camping out to deter thieves in 2018 when this image was taken. And in some instances, thieves caught stealing vanilla beans have been met with mob violence and extrajudicial killings. The ethnographer Sarah Osterhout, who's also affiliated with NYPG in the past, observes that violence is a fixed feature of this commodity market. So although mob violence was less common in the bust market a decade earlier in the aughts, where there was less demand for vanilla beans, there were also slower forms of violence, which she names as poor nutrition, the clearing of forests, the inability to provide children with healthcare. And while prices slowly stabilized in the years after Anawo, the connection between the vanilla beans and the market characterizes the way people treat and understand money. The ethnographer Anna Zhu argues that money acts as, quote, a volatile material that comes and goes, imbuing the region with fantastical undertones of alternating abundance and dearth. This volatility is only exacerbated on the local level by the region's vulnerability to the ongoing climate crisis and storms like 2017's Anawo. And the increasing frequency of these storms as the planet continues to warm only continues to affect this economy, and furthering the volatility and violence of vanilla bean production, which ultimately is only a fraction of our contemporary experiences of this flavor. In 2019, the US imported approximately 44% of the global supply of vanilla beans, most of which were destined to become vanilla extract or ice cream. And all of these handcrafted vanilla beans, about 500 plus tons, were not enough to sate tastes or sate appetites for this flavor in the US. Rather, vanilla beans are only responsible for about 2% of our experiences of vanilla flavor. The remaining 98% is compensated for by flavor chemists and perfumists through the production of vanillin. Notably, 85% of vanillin today, of about 20,000 tons of the global demand for this chemical, is synthesized from fossil fuel-derived petrochemicals, and 20 times cheaper than vanilla beans. Vanillin was first discovered in 1871 through these crystalline structures, which you can kind of see in this image here on the left and illustrated, of course, on the right, by two German scientists. This technology was invented only 30 years after Albius had developed the hand pollination method. So these were really working side by side, the desire for the chemical synthesis and also for the efficiency of the orchid as well. So while the initial reproduction and reception to vanillin was slow and mixed, it was largely embraced by flavor manufacturers in the early 20th century for its cost-effective properties, and ultimately found its way into many different products, from liquid flavorings to baking mixes to ice cream. Yet, despite the accessibility and eventual sheer ubiquity of synthetic vanilla flavorings, there remains a persistent stigma towards chemical food additives that are labeled artificial, synthetic, or otherwise not natural. In the long arc of American history, this is a phenomenon that waxes and wanes in its intensity. And overall, the US tends to fetishize naturalness. Natural is coded as good, and following that logic, the synthetic, which is often presented as nature's foil, is bad. So a renewed sensitivity toward the natural in the realm of vanilla emerged in 2014 when a Swiss synthetic biology company called Evolva created a genetically modified, or GM, yeast that could convert sugar to vanillin, excuse me. This product, also known as synbio-vanillin, is not regulated in the same way as more traditional vanillins or synthetic vanillas. Synbio-vanillin can be used interchangeably with those, quote, extracted from nature and still legally be called natural because they are made by living organisms, namely these GM yeasts. So while the label of natural vanilla flavoring is attractive to large food companies looking to cut production costs and play to public sentiments about natural versus artificial flavors, not all consumers are receptive to synbio-vanillin. Advocacy groups like Friends of the Earth, who in the name of human and planetary health, oppose GM foods. So in a 2014 blog post, the organization expressed concerns that synbio yeasts might have unforeseen consequences, such as exacerbating deforestation in the global south, or have unforeseen effects on human health and threaten the livelihood of vanilla growers, quote, the small sustainable producers of truly natural commodities. And the group lobbied ice cream companies to reject synbio-vanillin, and a number of them agreed. So a year later, in 2015, Nestle pledged to switch to botanically derived vanilla, adding additional pressure to the vanilla bean market only 2 years before Tropical Storm Nawo hit the region. So this multinational corporate investment in botanical vanilla, or at least vanilla that can carry the label of natural, is significant for the way it intensifies the status of vanilla as a cash crop in growing regions and exacerbates wealth disparities between landowners, growers, and processing workers, as well as those operating outside of the vanilla trade altogether. While the size of corporations make them impossible to ignore, the collective investment in botanical vanilla is cultivated across scales in the United States. So for example, part of my work as a fellow has meant turning to the Leicester T. Mertz Library's collections of cookbooks to analyze how authors portray vanilla to readers in the contents of their introductions, headnotes, ingredient guides, and recipes. So by and large, the cookbooks in the collection favor the botanical, and interestingly enough, often these books are the strongest advocates. The books that are the strongest advocates of the botanical vanilla also have a vested interest in botanical vanilla. So on the left is Patricia Rain's book, The Vanilla Chef, which was published in 2002. And this is her second vanilla-themed book. And it points readers towards her own corporation to source their vanilla, which was the Vanilla Company, which was a play on the .com e-business and at the turn of the new millennium. And the 2016 cookbook by the vanilla wholesaler Little Pod in the UK, Vanilla Cooking with One of the World's Finest Ingredients, also has a vested corporate interest in cultivating an appreciation for botanical vanilla. Even the tagline, the world's finest fragrance or ingredients, argues for botanical's worldliness and fine quality, which is a theme that I've traced back in my research to the 19th century and American advertising cookbooks, sometimes called corporate cookbooks. And while this kind of messaging in a cookbook is deeply normalized today, it is vital to understand the way we're receiving messages about vanilla and who is authoring those messages and for what purpose. I'm developing a blog post based on this vein of my research at NYPG, so please keep an eye on that in the coming months if you're interested. So overall, despite the persistent corporate investment in the botanical across scales, as well as that in cookbooks and public sentiment, and the initial pushback by the public to synbio-vanillin, a research team at the University of Edinburgh, led by Joanna Sadler and Stephen Wallace, announced the development of a new technology in June 2021 that would allow them to produce vanillin from plastic water bottle waste. The team engineered a strain of E. coli bacteria that would transform a molecule found in polyethylene terephthalate, which is PET, lightweight plastic, which is derived from fossil fuel petrochemicals. It's what most lightweight water bottles are made of. Like if you can squeeze it really well, it's probably a PET plastic. And they use this molecule, this transformed molecule in this synthesized E. coli bacteria to then produce vanillin, which is a fine chemical and has a high resale value. So this study, which was published in Green Chemistry, is a biochemical movement toward a more circular economy, as they claim. So the next phase involves developing a technology at scale to better meet the needs of the synbio vanillin market. And just like, sorry, I'll go back 1 second for this diagram because I really think it's amazing. The plastic water bottle waste, going through all the science, being eaten up by the E. coli bacteria. It's really something else. Okay. So overall, this research strikes me as a bit ironic. While critics of vanilla bean production might note the systemic extraction of resources from the vanilla orchid's growing zone along the equator, chemists now look to accomplish the same by leveraging the waste products of finite resources like petrochemicals worldwide to create new valuable fine chemicals like vanillin. Moreover, whether they're genetically modified yeast or water bottle eating E. coli bacteria, none of these solutions feel more natural to me than manually pollinating hundreds of thousands of vanilla orchid blooms. So taken collectively, the investment in vanilla is outstanding, from the vanilla orchid systematic cultivation, artificial pollination, to a broader ravenous market for the flavor that leads to persistent scientific interventions in attempts to bypass the botanical at a lower cost, to now the exploitation of other organisms like yeasts and bacteria, in addition to plants and people, to meet this desire for this aromatic substance. So I see all of these interventions as a kind of techno-chauvinism in the framework of Meredith Broussard, a belief that the technological intervention will solve the problems of humanity and the planet. Yet I think listening to the vanilla orchid, the source material for our complex experiences of vanilla, suggests that perhaps we should not have access to this flavor much at all. Without all of our interventions, would we really have this flavor? So perhaps rather than using technology to create, quote, value-added products like E. coli produced vanillin, our attention is better attuned to addressing an expectation of ever accessibility to a global pantry, especially in the face of an ever accelerating climate crisis and its inequitable social effects. So perhaps this reframing would allow US Americans to move away from the framework of plain vanilla or boring vanilla to appreciate the plant and human labor and knowledge that produces this complex flavor. Thank you. Oh, I have to unshare, apologies.
And thank you so much, Claire. That was an amazing conversation. Hold on 1 second. There we are. Thank you, Claire, for this fascinating story. I will never think of vanilla nonchalantly again, and I'm sure our audience doesn't either. We have a little bit of time left for some questions, and let me start. There is already one coming in. And audience members, please send in your questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you are also invited to upvote questions if you wish, which have been submitted. There are already some questions here. One actually asked you, Claire, why of all things you could study when it comes to plants and plant products we eat, what led you to the study of vanilla?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was sort of a roundabout process. I did my undergraduate thesis on apple pie in the US, so I was already thinking about plant life and flavors and these sort of iconic, really resonant cultural foods and their cultural histories. So I don't know, I feel like so many good projects start in the in-between moments when you're half thinking and half just doing. And so I had just finished a book for comprehensive exams, Andrew Warrens's book called Savage Barbecue. And in it, he has a really great reading of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And there's a scene where the Invisible Man is working in a paint factory. There's this allegory for the American experience and a gallon of paint, which is produced, it's white paint, but produced by adding drops of blackness to it. And I was thinking about my experience growing up eating French vanilla ice cream, which is often speckled with the seeds of vanilla beans, which I've now learned are the spent vanilla beans that have been ground up and added to the mixture. So it's not always the actual vanilla bean itself. And so that got me thinking like, oh, this is so interesting. There's blackness and whiteness. And then it's sort of this element of the boring and the banal. And as I sat with it and spun it around, it just really opened itself up to me. I was so lucky in that way.
That is an interesting way of getting to vanilla, and a good thing. Thank you so much. And there's also a question here for Audrey coming in, namely, how do you keep pests out of the gardens, rats, and so to eat the vegetables? And can you say a little bit more about the herbarium project that preserves the plants from these Bronx gardens?
Absolutely. I think that rats and pests in the gardens are one of the gardener's biggest concerns sometimes. It's definitely difficult in New York. There are lots of rats. And so people use different methods. One of the ways is to actually plant things that are rat deterrent. So attempts to put things in the garden that rats do not like to be around. And I don't remember all of the different plants that people use for that. There's also a lot of methods of filling the burrows with rocks or with foam and other efforts. Something people also try. Most gardens have a cat, a resident cat in them. And so people claim that that can also help to deter rats or scare them away. So there's many efforts, but it's an ongoing battle every single year. A garden never is done fighting rats, it seems. And then to talk about the herbarium project, it's exciting. We're just getting started, and there's actually an event on the 2nd of June to invite gardeners in to the herbarium to learn about what the herbarium offers. Herbariums are these big collections of plant specimens that have been dried and preserved, and so they hold knowledge that's both you can look at the plant. You can sometimes plants are tested for old ancient pests that have been in them. They test them for DNA, learning about their biological makeup. And in addition to that, we're hoping to expand on the ethnobotany side of that and the cultural connections that people have in relations with the plants. So the idea is to have gardeners learn how to collect these specimens if they're interested in preserving them, to be able to put them into the herbarium themselves, along with stories and things that are meaningful. And we're hoping to see where it goes. It's going to be a conversation to see what people actually want to get out of this project. Thanks for the question.
That is wonderful. And I'm bouncing back now to Claire, and there is a chemical question here. Is there a difference when it comes to the taste of vanilla between the plant directly derived from vanilla and those made with bacterial products? Are there other chemicals that make the vanilla flavor?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you. Absolutely. So in botanical vanilla, like a vanilla extract, pure vanilla extract, there are about 150 fragrant volatile molecules in that composition. Vanillin is the largest, most dominant note in that bouquet. And although we have like great technology to sort of help us identify those notes, we've never been able to synthesize a chemical vanillin that's like as complex. Now I'm sure you'll get blends that are quite advanced, but the chemists and flavorists are quite secretive about their formulations these days as IP. But yes, there's a great range, and I like to think about it as a form of terroir, like a taste of place. And it's also a taste of touch as well, that it's not just about where the vanilla bean is grown, but like who has handled it, the humidity in that specific place. And so people will note differences in flavor and aromatics between Mexican vanilla, bourbon vanilla, Tahitian vanilla. There's quite a big range. And one of the cookbooks here at NYBG actually suggested doing a taste test with like little samples of milk and adding in your extracts. You could also do it straight out of the bottle, I imagine. But the milk, the fat might be a nice carrier for that flavor if you're interested in doing regional tastings or tasting alongside a synthetic, which I would encourage us all to do to see what we're really eating. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And this is the beauty of these programs on Zoom. We already have the solution for the pests in gardens. Happily enough, I hear that organic veggies are not really liked by the New York rats. They prefer the junk food. So as long as we don't have that in the gardens, we seem to be okay-ish. It is also asked here by one of the attendants, does the Bronx have actually the most community gardens of all the boroughs in New York? What do you know, Audrey?
That's such a good question. I can't say that I have a definitive answer there. There's so many different counts of gardens around the city. One of the reasons being not all the gardens are public space gardens. And so some of the gardens may not even be known about in some cases. But what I would say is because the Bronx has over 200 gardens and there are 550 in the city that I'm aware of. It is possible that is up there, but also Brooklyn has a ton of gardens, Manhattan as well. Like all of the boroughs have lots of gardens. I'm not so sure about Staten Island's number of gardens, but they have a lot throughout the city. And so I would say the Bronx is definitely a contender, especially because I think there are a lot of gardens that may not be in that count. As we all know with data, it's not always perfect. So.
Indeed. Yeah, that's so true. And by the way, we have a question here about your herbarium. Will there also be a seed bank in conjunction with the herbarium project?
That's a really good question and a great idea. I know that seed banks are kept by people in their private homes. Some gardens have seed banks already. They may also have some specimens as well. I'm not aware that the botanical garden has a seed bank at this point, but they do capture seeds. So sometimes seeds are actually saved with the herbarium specimens. But to create an actual seed bank would be a big endeavor. And I think it's something we will talk about, I'm sure, as an idea. It's a great idea. Thank you.
Yes, and then Claire, do you situate your work in conversation with other food scholars who are interested in sensory analyses? For example, Michael Pollan's Botany of Desire. Is there a desire that emerges? Is there emotions that is connected to vanilla? Are we willing to sniff E. coli and plastic waste?
I love that question. It's been a long time since I've read Pollan's Botany of Desire, but absolutely, I'm situating this project in the broader field of critical food studies. So someone like Keela Tompkins, whose new project is oriented to jelly and the viscous, is very interesting to me. But also, yes, I think Pollan's general framework of desire is quite powerful, and I think is a huge motivator for many of our environmental and culinary and agricultural projects in the United States, and thinking about the US empire broadly. But yes, I think that if we didn't love vanilla so much, we probably wouldn't go to such great lengths as to sniff E. coli or produce all of this material from petrochemicals, or even go so far as to the manual pollination of the flower is what really trips me up, because it's such a small window and a delicate process. There's some videos online that you can see of the pollination process, and knowing that's just step one of a months long endeavor to produce the vanilla bean that we, is just sort of staggering. So yes, there's I think all of this is backed by a huge amount of desire, but I look forward to revisiting pollen. I appreciate that nudge. Thank you.
That's wonderful. And then one of the final questions we have time for is for Audrey, whether you're aware of the Bartram Garden in Philadelphia. One of our Philadelphia participants is wondering that they're also trying to combine history, community, and economics. And they have also Sankova Farm. Can you say anything about maybe building connections?
Absolutely. I've heard a lot about Philadelphia's urban gardening and community gardening scene. They do a lot with food justice and access. I had not heard of Bartram's Garden, but I'm very interested in visiting. So I will definitely be adding that to my list for my visit to Philadelphia, which must happen at some point. But in terms of connecting, the gardens are nationally connected in many ways, because people not only move around. So in the Bronx, a lot of people are actually from different areas. So people will spend time in the South in the winter. They'll come back up to the Bronx or other parts of the New York during the summer to garden. And so there's a lot of connections outside of the city that I really do want to explore as I move further in my research.
Thank you. And thank you all, also audience. The hour has really flown by, and what a conversation it has been. I wish we could continue. Thank you, Audrey and Claire, for your latest discoveries, and we look forward to your publications. And audience, please, if you have missed anything of this event, do not worry, you can watch it again. A recording will be saved and shared on the NYBG lecture library. And we hope you will join us, maybe this time also in real person, for our upcoming Humanities Symposium on site at the New York Botanical Garden on Saturday, June 17. It will focus on the African American garden, the Caribbean experience, and it will feature Jessica Harris in conversation with Jamaica Kincaid, and an interesting panel discussion afterwards with an expert team of knowing about the power of sugar. And you will see in your chat information about the symposium, and there you can sign up. And I'd like to thank you all and say goodbye and say until next time, please stay well, stay green, and take good care. Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.